Could an African country essentially go broke because of the Iran war? That's a distinct possibility the longer the conflict continues. And defaults come with painful consequences, from cuts to social services like health, education, or public sector wages. But how do they even happen? Which countries are in the most danger? And what can they or other countries do to prevent them? Well, let's take a look. First of all, how does a country even go broke? Well, just like a business, it owes more to its creditors than it can manage to pay. It defaults on one or multiple loans. Ask Zambia, or Ghana, or Ethiopia, or Chad. All have defaulted in recent years on sovereign loans. That's debt issued to domestic or international borrowers. In Zambia's case, heavy borrowing for large infrastructure projects left it with a lot of debt to pay and a very tight purse. The COVID-19 pandemic then put the squeeze on the budget in 2020, forcing a default. The pandemic and the Ukraine war also hit Ghana very hard, raising prices, taking away very important tourism dollars, and removing capital as investors fled for safety. The country defaulted in 2022. The restructuring that followed in Ghana has been costly, as it has been for all four of those nations. It's meant even tighter budgets as government trims spending on things like healthcare, public sector wages, and education in order to meet restructured payment plans. And in the case of Ghana, it left pensioners worried about their retirement savings. Well, today we see a familiar situation across the continent as a new crisis breaks out. Countries are still sitting on piles of debt. Many haven't seen growth return to pre-pandemic levels, and that means deficit spending is rising, a familiar cycle.
So you take on a debt.
That's Waris Atiya, a lawyer in Kenya and expert on debt problems in Africa.
If you took it on before COVID, for example, then you thought you were going to recover in your economy and invest within 4 or 5 years, but COVID hits. And suddenly, again, your economic indicators are now not playing through. So what you have is a scenario of you've taken on a debt and committed to an interest rate, but your economy, even if there is perfect use of the money, that economic growth is not taking place because of factors outside your control. And the war that we're dealing with right now is another trigger mechanism.
There are other structural issues at play. Let's have a listen to what the World Bank's managing director told our podcast, The Dip, about vulnerable African economies.
They tend to be particularly reliant on energy that is brought into their economy, that's imported into their economy. They tend to have particularly high employment needs and challenges, and we're very focused on what those issues will be.
Again, those structural problems are now running into the newest global crisis, Iran and its consequences, and specifically the specter of inflation. Now, inflation was already rising in Nigeria and South Africa in March, even before oil prices really picked up.
Even though some of these economies are really big, they're still feeling the effect of the energy shock that we now can see taking hold.
Those figures are almost certain to be much higher in April. Now, inflation is a word, but in this case it means higher fuel or fertilizer prices, really, which trickle down into everything else and right into normal pockets.
So I will tell you that the moment the price of fuel goes up, it has a direct effect on the cost of goods that hit the market, especially for poor people.
And when prices rise, people pull back on spending.
Expenditure is going down, which also means in turn that the government, who was projecting that they would collect a certain amount of tax revenue to then pay off its debt, is now not going to hit its markers.
Another problem is that local currencies are weakening due to the crisis. Weaker currencies make debt and imports in other currencies, think dollars, far more expensive. So who is in the biggest trouble? Senegal and Mozambique stand out in particular. Senegal was already under a debt restructuring program with the International Monetary Fund, which helps crisis-stricken economies. Then the IMF froze funding after realizing the country hadn't reported all of its debt. Meanwhile, Senegal needs to borrow a whopping quarter of its 2026 budget just to meet spending and debt repayment needs. Ratings agency S&P recently cut its currency rating further into junk status. Mozambique's debt is estimated by the IMF to be 106% of its economic output for 2026. Annual growth has meanwhile slowed to a meager 0.5 percentage point, and that's actually an improvement from a recession in 2025. The question will be how both countries and others in Africa manage the current crisis. Here's Amaka Anku, who focuses on Africa policy for the Eurasia Group.
I think this just highlights those vulnerabilities, and I think those countries were always going to have to restructure. They were always going to have to, do something about their debts. And that's not going to change.
Amaka says the immediate danger facing these countries is still relatively low, but that the length of this crisis and the response to it will be critical. One danger area is if countries have to spend more from their budgets.
A lot of the African countries will not have as much range to spend money to stimulate the economy if we are in this situation for months on end and we get to a global recession. It might be harder for African economies to come out of that in terms of how the fiscal responses.
In other words, countries will have a problem if they have to dig even deeper into already tight budgets to help households. Unfortunately, that kind of scenario is very easy to imagine. People around the world right now are turning to their governments for help with higher costs. In Senegal, Mozambique, or other countries, the pressure is likely to be the same, if not even greater. That makes this conflict especially dangerous for Africa, the longer it lasts. In fact, the chief Africa economist for global bank Citi recently said he could imagine defaults from 3 African countries in the next 2 years: Senegal, Mozambique, and Malawi. The picture isn't completely dire. First of all, experts agree that in general, African countries are better positioned than they were at the beginning of COVID. Exporters of commodities, for example, think cacao or coffee, were definitely better off going into the crisis.
It meant that their FX reserves were high, and so they were able to keep the currency stable, and inflation was going down in most of those countries. So I would say the big winners before were Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Uganda, some of these guys who were in South Africa.
Of course, a global recession would change their fortunes as demand would fall. Now, another thing, access to capital has been a bit easier in the past year. That's according to Amaka, in part because more investors were looking outside the US. And so far, there's been no overwhelming flight to safety from investors. Think US bonds, like we saw during the pandemic, and which came at the expense of developing economies. There are even potentially positive aspects of the current crisis. Oil producers in Nigeria should be in a better position with higher oil prices. The pinch on natural gas could also boost efforts to build an LNG terminal in Mozambique. That's an on-again, off-again project by Total Energies. And just like in the rest of the world, the oil crunch may bring new emphasis to Africa to develop renewables.
Now is the opportunity when governments will be really looking for alternatives. I think that that's a silver lining.
But what can wealthier nations do to help prevent the worst-case scenario? Well, the situation facing poor nations, and African ones in particular, was a major focus of a series of meetings last week between 2 of the biggest financial multilateral organizations out there, the IMF and the World Bank. And they've promised more assistance.
So the assistance would look like reprioritizing the economic program that we would have with many partner countries to provide additional short-term financial support to them, and to bring that to life with the resources that taxpayers in more developed economies make available to us. The World Bank Group would have the ability to deploy anywhere between $20 and $25 billion of support to economies who are in this phase of challenge.
Wealthier nations that make up the G20 have also made debt relief a priority in recent years. In fact, in 2020, the organization established a new framework to help countries entering default. Now, those 4 nations we mentioned earlier, Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, and Chad, all restructured their debt with the help of the G20. Any new defaults would likely be handled in the same manner. The coming months will tell the story of African finances and what this crisis means for them. But one thing has been clear for as long as I've been paying attention. Africa's higher debt loads have become a persistent problem, especially in the era of constant crises that affect global trade. The pinch on public finances limits the reforms that nations can undertake, indeed that they desperately need to make. After all, Africa is the world's youngest continent and its fastest growing. It needs jobs and social stability. The fate of economies there will have consequences not just for African households, but for countries around the world.